Amber Cox is always loud after a win. Amber Cox with the response. Nonsense. You know who was also happy after any win? Cece. We all cannot wait to have Cece back on the court. Enough with this ridiculous narrative. All piling on Caitlin Clark, calling her a bad teammate, a selfish player, this, that, and third.
The Indiana Fever sit at 12 wins and 9 losses in mid-July, a record that on paper keeps them inside playoff position in a crowded Eastern Conference. But the number that has come to define their season is not in the win column. It is 106.4, Indiana's defensive rating, 8th in the league, and the engine behind a stretch of basketball that has left the fan base more frustrated than the standings alone would suggest. Through July 8th, the Fever had allowed 100 or more points in 8 separate games, tying them for the second most such games in a single WNBA season on record, one behind the mark set by the 2024 Dallas Wings. Indiana has won 7 in those games, with their only win coming in overtime against the Chicago Sky back on June 11. 23 games remained on the schedule at that point, meaning the record was well within reach. That defensive collapse has become the backdrop for a much broader argument taking place across Fever social media. One that has pulled in the front office, the coaching staff, and the handling of the team's franchise player, Caitlin Clark. 3 separate storylines have converged over the past several weeks, and together they have produced a level of public friction between the organization and its fan base that the team has not faced before. The most recent flashpoint came on July 10, after the Fever beat the Phoenix Mercury on the road in a game packed with traveling Indiana fans. General Manager and Chief Operating Officer Amber Cox posted on X thanking supporters for showing up both at home and away. It was the kind of routine, low-risk message franchises post after a win. A fan replied, writing that Cox is always loud after a win without Clark, pointing out that Clark did not play in that game. Cox responded directly, calling the insinuation nonsense. She wrote that Clark is happy after any win, that the team celebrates and cares for one another, that everyone is looking forward to having Clark back on the court, and that fans should drop what she called a ridiculous narrative. It is unusual for a general manager to personally engage a fan's social media post rather than let it pass. Some coverage framed Cox's response as a reasonable pushback against an unfounded insinuation, but for a portion of the fan base already primed to see the front office as reactive and image-conscious, the exchange reinforced an existing complaint that leadership shows up quickly to defend its own reputation online, while staying largely silent through weeks of national media criticism directed at its rookie-era stars and, more pointedly, through a stretch in which the team's on-court performance and coaching decisions have drawn sustained fan backlash. The frustration is less about the content of Cox's reply and more about the pattern fans believe it represents. A front office quick to correct the record about itself, slower to visibly stand behind the players when the criticism gets harder to answer. That frustration exists alongside a genuinely unusual development. Members of the United States Congress are now formally involved in the conversation about how Caitlin Clark is officiated and protected on the floor. In a letter led by Representative August Pfluger, chairman of the House Republican Study Committee, and co-signed by roughly a dozen lawmakers including members from Indiana, a group of House Republicans pressed WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert to address what they characterized as a pattern of physical hostility toward Clark. The letter cited specific incidents, Clark being hip-checked, poked in the eye, and struck in the throat during games, and argued the league's response has been inadequate. It invoked the Department of Justice, the Department of Labor, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, suggesting that if discrimination or retaliation were found to be creating a hostile work environment, it could constitute a violation of federal civil rights law. Lawmakers set a deadline of July 24 for a response from the league. The letter followed roughly 2 weeks after Phoenix Mercury forward Alyssa Thomas made contact with her fist to Clark's throat during a June 24 game. The play was not called as a foul in real time, but the league later upgraded it to a flagrant foul and suspended Thomas for 1 game for what it described as recklessly making contact. Thomas has said the contact was a complete accident and stated publicly that she has received death threats since the incident. Clark and her head coach, Stephanie White, have both condemned the threats directed at Thomas. The reaction to the congressional letter itself has been split. Some commentators criticize the involvement of lawmakers as an unnecessary escalation, arguing it frames ordinary physical basketball plays in racially charged terms for political purposes. Others, including some members of Congress, have argued the physical treatment of the league's most popular player warrants outside scrutiny given her outsized role in driving the league's television ratings, attendance, and sponsorship growth. The Fever organization has stated it had no contact with the congressional group and was unaware of the letter before its release, and the league itself has not issued a public response. Whatever one makes of the letter's merits, Its existence has added another layer to fan frustration with team leadership. The argument circulating among a portion of the fan base is not about whether Congress should be involved. Reasonable people disagree on that, but about how visibly and consistently the Fever's own front office has advocated for player protection compared to how quickly it responds to criticism of itself. The second major thread running through fan discontent centers on head coach Stephanie White's rotation decisions, and it predates the current defensive collapse. The clearest flashpoint came in a May 31 loss to the expansion Portland Fire, when White substituted Clark, Aaliyah Boston, and Lexi Hull out of the game at the 6:30 mark of the first quarter, with Indiana leading 8-4. Portland responded with a 13-2 run and never looked back, eventually building a 29-15 lead by the end of the quarter and winning 184. Asked afterward why she made the change, White said Boston remained on a minutes restriction, and that Clark's removal followed the team's normal rotation pattern. She added that Indiana had deviated from that pattern in an earlier game against Golden State because the staff did not want rookie Raven Johnson on the floor in that environment without another ball handler alongside her. The explanation did not satisfy a large segment of the fan base. Criticism ranged from basketball-specific complaints that pulling a rhythm player after 3 minutes disrupts her flow more than it protects her, to accusations that White was, in the words of some fans on social media, deliberately undermining Clark. A sideline video from the same game, showing an animated exchange between White and Clark during a timeout huddle, circulated widely and intensified the speculation, though a review of the footage found no clear evidence supporting claims that it had been altered, nor evidence confirming what was actually said between them. One prominent analyst publicly stated that White was, in his view, the wrong coach for Clark. It is worth noting the basketball context. White inherited a team that made the WNBA semifinals in 2025, even with Clark missing extended time to injury, and her 3 prior seasons as a head coach, including 2 with the Connecticut Sun, all ended in semifinal appearances. That track record complicates the narrative that she is simply an ineffective coach, even as her in-game decisions continue to draw scrutiny. The pattern resurfaced again after Clark's return from a 2-week back injury absence. She played just 16 minutes in a 106-92 loss to the Los Angeles Sparks on July 8, finishing with 9 points on a night many fans felt she looked ready for a heavier workload. White managed her minutes cautiously, consistent with a team coming off injury, but a significant portion of the fan base rejected the explanation outright, insisting the limited playing time reflected an ongoing pattern rather than a one-off precaution tied to her back. Fever guard Kelsey Mitchell, addressing the team's larger defensive struggles after that game, said the issue went beyond any single player, noting that Indiana's defense had let the team down and that finding consistency on that end had to start with players holding themselves accountable. The current run of blown leads did not appear suddenly. As early as mid-May, before most of this season's controversies had taken shape, analysts were already flagging Indiana's defense as a structural concern. The Fever ranked 9th in defensive efficiency as of May 19, a regression from where the team finished the 2025 season. The drop-off was especially pronounced at home, where Indiana's defensive rating was among the worst in the league at that point in the year. White had spent the preseasons emphasizing what the staff called a know-your-purse philosophy, built around players internalizing detailed scouting reports on each opponent. Early film showed the opposite. Persistent overcommitments and over-rotations from the perimeter that repeatedly collapsed the defense back onto Aaliyah Boston, leaving the Fever center as the last line of protection far more often than the scheme was designed to require. White herself acknowledged the inconsistency publicly in mid-May, saying the team was doing some good things in flashes but was still fouling too much and suffering too many breakdowns, and that the unit needed to improve day by day. That inconsistency has persisted into July. Some advanced models place Indiana's defense closer to the middle of the pack. Others, including the more recent data cited around the Sparks loss, place them closer to the bottom third of the league. Either way, the on-court result has been the same. A team capable of standing toe-to-toe with the league's best on a given night, and just as capable of surrendering 100 points to a team with a losing record. There is a structural explanation as well. Indiana's offense has grown more, not less, dependent on Clark and Kelsey Mitchell as the season has progressed, with Clark's direct touch rate climbing from an already high 39.4 per game in 2024 to 40.9 this season. Boston's role has stayed remarkably stable as a screener and rebounder rather than an additional shot-creating threat, and the team ranks in the bottom half of the league in offensive turnover value. a problem that compounds the defensive issues since live ball turnovers push Indiana directly into transition defense, the exact situation where its perimeter breakdowns are most exposed. None of this is a hidden or disputed narrative inside the organization. White has discussed the turnover and defensive consistency issues in post-game media sessions repeatedly. The disconnect is less about whether the problems are real and more about whether fans believe the coaching staff's public explanations match what they are seeing on the floor. The coaching and front office controversies have not developed in isolation. They have unfolded against a backdrop of a season already saturated with debate over how Clark and the Fever are treated by officials and by the league's broader media and player ecosystem. Clark has drawn 5 technical fouls this season, the most recent coming after a heated exchange with Mercury forward and former Fever meet teammate Dewana Bonner. She has been vocal about the toll of constant scrutiny, saying that people sometimes forget she is navigating all of this at 24 years old, and that the attention affects her more than she typically lets on publicly. That scrutiny extends beyond officiating and into how her peers and the league itself have positioned her. Fans were quick to note the gap between her overwhelming popularity with the public. She finished as the second leading vote getter for this year's All-Star game, and how her fellow players ranked her, elsewhere placing her 11th among the league's guards in a separate poll. Hall of Famer Candace Parker publicly pushed back on that ranking, calling it indefensible. For a fan base already primed to see Clark as undervalued and underprotected by the institutions around her, the gap between fan sentiment and peer sentiment became one more data point in a broader argument that the people responsible for protecting and showcasing the league's biggest draw are consistently a step behind the audience that has made her, and by extension the Fever, financially central to the league's growth. What connects these 3 threads? The general manager's social media exchange, the congressional letter, and the substitution controversy is not any single decision but a cumulative sense among a portion of Fever fans that the organization is more responsive to protecting its own image than to addressing the concerns being raised about the product on the floor and the treatment of its franchise player. The team has, by its own account, driven the WNBA to record ratings, attendance, and merchandise sales largely on the strength of Clark's popularity. That commercial reality has raised the stakes on every decision the front office and coaching staff make, and it has shortened the fan base's patience for explanations that sound like standard operating procedure. None of this erases the legitimate basketball explanations offered by the team. Aaliyah Boston's minutes restriction following a lower leg injury is real and has shaped several of White's rotation decisions. Clark's back injury was confirmed and documented, and a cautious return workload is a standard and defensible medical approach, not evidence of an agenda. The Fever's defensive struggles are also not disputed by the organization. Head coach White has spoken publicly and repeatedly about the team's need to be more consistent on that end, describing incremental progress rather than claiming the issue is solved. But explanations rooted in basketball logic have not been enough to quiet an audience that increasingly views every substitution, every social media reply, and every public statement through a lens of suspicion. That suspicion did not appear overnight. It has built across a season in which the team's record has stayed competitive while its defensive performance has visibly regressed, in which the franchise's biggest star has missed time to injury and returned to a cautious deployment that many fans read as underutilization, and in which the front office's most visible recent public engagement with its fan base was an argument rather than an olive branch. The congressional letter adds a layer of institutional weight to a conversation that had, until recently, played out almost entirely on social media and between fans and beat reporters. Whether or not the WNBA responds by the July 24 deadline lawmakers set, the letter has already shifted the terms of the debate. It is no longer only a question of whether officiating and physical play toward Clark are fair. It is now a question of whether the league, and by extension the Fever organization itself, is taking that question seriously enough. A question the team says it has answered privately through its ongoing dialogue with the league office, even as a vocal segment of its own fan base says it has not seen enough evidence of that publicly. For an organization that has spent the past 2 years transformed from one of the league's smaller markets into arguably its most commercially significant franchise, the challenge now is not building interest. That work is done. The challenge is managing an audience large enough, invested enough, and online enough that every decision, however routine it might look from inside a coaching staff's game plan, gets read as a referendum on whether the people running the team actually understand what their fans are asking for. There is also a broader league context worth noting. The Fever are not the only franchise navigating friction between coaching decisions, player health management, and an increasingly vocal, increasingly online fan base, the WNBA's overall growth has meant every team's internal decisions are now scrutinized at a volume the league has never experienced before. Players and coaches across the league have voiced complaints of their own this season about inconsistent officiating standards following a league-wide review process, suggesting some of what Fever fans are reacting to reflects tension built into the league's current moment rather than something unique to one franchise's front office. That context does not resolve the specific complaints being raised about Indiana's own decision-making, but it does help explain why the response to those decisions has been so immediate and so loud. A fan base watching its team's biggest star draw record ratings while absorbing repeated physical contact, inconsistent officiating calls, and a defense that has surrendered more 100-point games than all but one team in league history is a fan base primed to interpret every subsequent decision through the worst possible lens. Whether that lens is fair to Stephanie White, whose coaching record before this season included 3 consecutive semifinal appearances, or to Amber Cox, whose front office has overseen the franchise's transformation from one of the league's least-watched teams into arguably its most valuable, is a separate question from whether the frustration itself is understandable. Both things can be true. The organization can point to legitimate basketball and medical explanations for many of its decisions, and a fan base that has watched its investment in this team grow alongside a growing list of unresolved concerns can still feel, reasonably, that its questions are not being answered quickly enough or directly enough. That gap between explanation and reassurance is where the current tension lives, and it is unlikely to close until the team either starts winning more convincingly or starts communicating with its audience in a way that feels less like damage control and more like partnership. For now, the Fever head into the second half of their season with a winning record, a franchise player working her way back from injury, a head coach facing repeated questions about her substitution patterns, a front office that has shown it is willing to publicly engage its critics, and a Congress that has given the league until July 24 to respond to concerns about how its biggest star is being protected. All of it is playing out in front of the largest audience women's professional basketball has ever had, which means none of it is playing out quietly.